I'm Bill Brown with Brookings Mountain West, and we're here to talk tonight about student debt, which shockingly will probably be an interesting topic here on campus. I know I had my share of student debt back longer ago than you care to remember. Never mind, I care to remember. But we're thrilled to have our colleague Beth Akers out from the Brookings Institution. Beth is a fellow in economic studies there, so she's a proud economist. So you'll see the obligatory graphs and charts and numbers tonight, but don't hurt yourself taking notes. We already have the PowerPoint up on our website, so you'll have that to refer to. Thanks to our colleagues from Greenspun College here, you'll also be able to watch yourselves in a few days if you care to. But Beth is a specialist in higher education and particularly student debt, but her economics background included some service as the staff economist to the Council on Economic Advisors back in the last couple of years of the Bush administration, right? Before the Obama administration. So she's been looking at this topic in higher ed for quite some time. And she's also doing some actual research here on campus with our financial aid office. UNLV is one of a handful of universities that she's studying, and we look forward to seeing that report later this year. Obviously, it'll get a lot of publicity here in town and around campus, but it'll help illuminate this national discussion of student debt. And we'll discuss tonight whether it's a crisis or not, who it's a crisis for, and we'll hopefully have some time for questions at the end. Beth?
Okay, thanks so much, Bill. So thanks for that nice introduction. I think you did a nice job of explaining where I've come from before today. I'm an economist by training. As Bill mentioned, I got my feet wet working on higher education policy when I was working in the Bush administration with the Council of Economic Advisors. We had a project there working on the federal lending program, and so I learned an awful lot about it at that time, and then went back to graduate school and finished my dissertation writing on the subject. But spent a few years there sort of insulated from the policy discussion and really kind of focused on what academics were talking about when it came to higher education. So following that, I took this position at the Brookings Institution. I've been there for about 4 years now. And one of my roles there is talking to the media and answering questions from newspaper reporters and things like that, helping them to understand what's going on in different issues. And one of the questions that I was getting over and over when I first started there that was a little bit of a surprise to me was the question of, is there a student loan crisis on the horizon? So regardless of what the interview was about, it always ended with that question, or at least that's how it seemed to me. And maybe it shouldn't have been surprising to me, but it was, and it was surprising because I was coming from a place where I had been studying the academic literature on higher education, which pretty clearly shows that there's a strong positive financial return to higher education. So the best estimates we have is that a bachelor's degree has a rate of return of about 15%, right? So it's if we were to put into the terms of something like you'd measure in the stock market, right? The rate of return of 15%, that's pretty fantastic. So I'm thinking, okay, so we've got this investment opportunity for young people with a 15% rate of return. The federal government is making sure they have the credit available to make that investment. They're giving them loans at subsidized interest rates. So how is it possible we've got a crisis here? So this is sort of my naive economist way of thinking about the issue, but it's really this dissonance between the way that the media and the public is talking about student debt and the way that I was thinking about it through this economic lens that prompted me to do the research that I've been doing for the past 4 years. And so the title of the talk today, The Rhetoric and the Reality on Student Debt, is really my attempt to compile a lot of the work that I've done in this area. So thinking about the way that the public generally thinks about debt and putting some numbers behind it, so adding some facts into the discussion about debt and hopefully leading us into the right direction when it comes to thinking about federal policy and state and institution policy around higher education. So as I said, there was this dissonance between understanding the financial return to a college degree and the popular narrative that was driving the work. And so first, I'm an empirical researcher by nature, so a lot of my work is going to be looking at numbers and trying to paint a picture of what's happening in this market through data. But the first step in understanding what was happening here was to think about how do the ways in which the public are thinking and talking about student debt may be wrong, because that gives you a hint of where to go with this type of analysis. So when I do that, I come up with a couple mistakes that I think are pretty pervasive in the popular dialogue about this issue. So the first one is what an economist, or I'll call an unrealistic counterfactual. So this is the old argument that says, look, if you didn't have to pay back your student loans, you'd be much better off, right? I'm paying $250 every month to pay back this student loan. If I didn't have to pay that back, surely I'd be better off, right? Therefore, the world is a better place without student debt, right? It's sort of a naive argument. It's probably not one that most people would come up with if they thought too deeply about it, but it is one that's kind of implicit in a lot of the discussions about higher education. And so we can put this label on it of an unrealistic counterfactual. What that really means is that we're not thinking of a realistic alternative, right? We can't wipe away that $250 a month payment that all the students have who have outstanding student debt now without some consequences. So what are the consequences that we'd like to have? One realistic alternative is we could say, well, would a student be willing to give back their degree in exchange for not having to make that monthly payment on their student loan, right? Statistics say that most people would not, right? Because these degrees are worth it. They're worth it in terms of financial returns, and they're probably worth it in other ways that are more difficult to measure. Sure, there are people who would gladly return their degree in exchange for not having to make their student loan payments, but that seems to be a minority of the people who have borrowed just because of what we know about the broad financial returns to higher education. So that's the first one. Thinking realistically about if we don't have student debt, what is the alternative? Other alternatives you can think of are that we could increase subsidies to higher education, right? We increase subsidies not by picking money off of trees, but by raising taxes. So imposing costs on other people and redistributing wealth in different ways. And so that's what we want to think about. And it seems to me that the superficial conversation about student debt wasn't taking that into account. So I think that's one of the real mistakes. The second is I think that we're not doing the right cost-benefit analysis for the most part when we think about higher education and student debt in particular. So I've had this experience over and over. Let me describe it to you. So I'm in a social setting and someone says, oh, what do you do? And I say, oh, I sit around and think about student loans all day and try to craft recommendations for better public policy. So they say, let me tell you a story about so-and-so. So-and-so has $30,000 in student loan debt, and so-and-so makes $40,000 a year. Isn't that just horrific? What's wrong with this nation? Clearly we have a crisis, all this and all this. And of course, because I'm very good socially, I act very sympathetic, and I say, oh yeah, how awful, you know. But what I'm really thinking is, what I'd like to know is what is so-and-so's lifetime income with their degree relative to what it would have been absent their degree or absent their access to that debt, right? And so that never goes well in a social situation to describe that. So I avoid doing that, but that's the right way to be thinking about it, right? And so we're not doing that. What we're neglecting to think about is that education is an investment that pays off over the course of a very long time. So when we do this cost-benefit analysis, is it worth it? We need to think about the benefits that accrue over the course of a lifetime. Second, that's sort of the micro embodiment of the cost-benefit analysis. The macro one, I think, is even a little bit more egregious. So most likely you've heard the $1.3 trillion number. So that's saying there's $1.3 trillion in outstanding student loan debt in our economy right now. And the way that this is spoken about, you would think that those $1.3 trillion were thrown into a black hole, right? Let's not forget that these are $1.3 trillion that were invested in an asset that we've estimated has a historical rate of return of 15%. That's fantastic, right? That's a good thing. That's a positive indicator for the economy. So what I'd love to see is the benefit side of that equation, right? So we've spent $1.3 trillion. We've spent that on investing in this asset. So what are the yields in terms of future GDP, right? That's the equivalent in a macro sense that we should be thinking about when we look at this number. So basically, these are the mistakes that I think are driving the narrative about debt. And it's kind of leading us in the wrong direction when it comes to thinking about what are the appropriate policy interventions in higher education and in student debt. And they're really the basis for the empirical analysis that I've done at Brookings over the past 4 years. A lot of it we're in collaboration with my co-author Matthew Chingos, who's now a scholar at the Urban Institute, but we continue to have some of this research in common. So I'm going to plug ahead here and show you some numbers to tell you what I think is happening in this market. But I want to give you the cliff notes first, just in case I don't succeed in capturing your attention for the next 45 minutes, which it seems unlikely, but it's possible, right? So let me just run through. I want to give you some bullet point ideas of what you should be taking away from this discussion. First of all, 1/4 of the increase that we've seen in debt over the past 2 decades is due to the fact that people are getting more education. Okay, so we think about there are maybe good reasons for student debt to be increasing and maybe bad reasons, and maybe we don't all agree on which is which, but the fact that people are getting more education, that's not a bad reason for debt to be increasing. And it kind of takes the edge off the concern, right? It backs you off of that hysterical notion about the increase in debt that we've seen when you think about it that way. Number 2, large debt balances are really exceedingly rare. So we read a lot about people with very large balances in newspaper stories about student debt. It turns out those folks are really outliers. And I'm going to show you the statistics on that. For the most part, people have modest amounts of debt and have hopefully invested wisely. The monthly burden of student loan debt has actually declined over time. So this is probably of my research, the most controversial piece of data, and we'll talk about it once we get to that picture. Just to foreshadow a little bit, this is a picture that when I graphed it, when I spit out the plot, I was sure I must have done it upside down. Because this point is just inconsistent, wildly inconsistent with the narrative, right? On a monthly basis, the burden of student loan debt has gotten less over time. That doesn't quite fit, right? So let's figure out what's happening there. The next point, we read a lot about the relationship between student debt and the economy, student debt and entrepreneurship, student debt and homeownership in particular. So these studies are still inconclusive. So a lot of the coverage suggests that we have causal evidence about the relationship between debt and homeownership in particular. It's just not the case. I'm not saying a relationship doesn't exist, but I think that we've overblown the rhetoric about this particular issue when it comes to debt. And I think it's important that we don't assume we know what we don't already know. Those are sort of the cliff notes. If we have some time at the end, I'll tell you what I think are some of the real problems when it comes to student debt. If it's not, in fact, this story that the sky is falling and we have a macro crisis in student lending. So let's come to that at the end. Okay, so if you have paid much attention to the conversation about higher education, this picture won't be a surprise to you. We've seen that for a few decades, increases in tuition, these are published tuition and fees, have outpaced inflation. So the prices of higher education have increased more quickly than the prices in any other sector of the economy, including healthcare, which we know has also had pretty rapid inflation. So to put some numbers behind that, over the past 20 years, tuition and fees has more than doubled at 4-year public institutions, and it's increased by about half at 4-year private and 2-year public institutions. So when you think about this in the context of what's happening with debt, you know, we talked before about there being maybe good reasons and maybe bad reasons for debt to be increasing. Estimates suggest that about half of the increase in debt that we've seen over these 20 years is directly attributable to the fact that it just costs more to go to college. Okay? So people say, well, this is certainly a problem, right? College is just too expensive, and how do we fix that problem? Another way of looking at this is that price is a problem only to the extent that it outweighs the future benefits of the educational opportunity, right? So we think about the value of a degree, that we're talking strictly financial value, just because that's what's easy to measure here, and of course that's what's on the minds of a lot of students in this country, but I recognize readily that there are other returns to education beyond financial. But if the financial returns in the long run do not exceed the upfront price, then the price is the problem, or price is a problem. But if that's not the case, and that doesn't seem to be the case on average, at least historically, then price may not be a problem, right? In a sense, even though the price is high and has been growing, college does seem to still be worth it. Okay, so that's kind of a contrarian point of view when it comes to price. So I think what we don't need to be concerned about so much is the level of the price here, but the trajectory of the price. So price has increased over time, but it's still the case that the bump in wages that you get from a degree is enough to offset the increases in prices that we've seen. Is it possible that price will continue to increase at the rate that we see here, and also the long-run wages will also continue to offset that increase? That's where we sort of have a question. And that's something that I'm concerned about. Not the level of the price, but the trajectory of the increase in price. And why is it that price is increasing so quickly in this market? People are often quick to point finger at the institutions for this. I think if anything's going to stop it, it's going to become savvier shopping from the student side of things. Students are going to need to demand efficiency from the institutions. So let's go ahead. This is what's happening in debt over time, over the past 20 years. And this is based on my original research using a data set called the Survey of Consumer Finances. It takes basically a snapshot of a representative set of households across the country, a snapshot of their financial positions. And one of the things that we measure is their outstanding student loan balance. So a lot of the other data sets and studies on student debt in higher education are looking at debt at the time of graduation. So we're doing something slightly different here, which is just looking at a snapshot of a point in time for the set of young households, which we've defined as ages 20 to 40. What does their outstanding debt look like? There are advantages and disadvantages of measuring debt in this way, but what I think this does is it captures more of what the true financial burden is on these young families, perhaps more so than the snapshot at the time of graduation. So what do we see happening here is that among households with debt, so among those households that have at least some student loan balance, we've seen that their balances have more than tripled over the past 20 years. So a pretty dramatic increase during that period. In 1989, the average household that had debt had a balance of $5,800, so just shy of $6,000. And in 2013, which is the most recent year of data that we have for this study, the average had increased to $19,000. So just shy of $20,000. So we've absolutely, without question, seen dramatic growth in debt. A lot of people point at this and say we very clearly have a crisis because of this fact alone. And again, I go back to the need to do cost-benefit analysis and recognize that in higher education yields benefits over a long run. And any analysis of the state of this market needs to look at the long-run benefits in comparison to these short-run costs or these measures that reflect cost. So what's not visible in this picture, but is also really important in telling the story of student debt over time, is that the number of households who have debt has also increased. So in 1989, the first data point on this series, 14% of households were carrying some student loan debt, and in 2013 that had increased to 40%. So it's no wonder, really, that this has become a popular topic with policymakers and the media, because there are just much more people who are facing this issue in terms of their household finances. Okay, so this picture comes back to one of those teaser points that I gave you at the beginning in thinking about how rare are those very high balance borrowers. So far we've talked about means and medians. They don't tell the whole story about what's happening. Remember, we said the mean household in 2013 that had debt had about $20,000 in debt, not the $100,000 that we often see portrayed in media stories about student debt. And so what this does is just illustrates the distribution. So the pie chart is one for each of the most recent years of data. Just to pull out some statistics off of here for you, in both 2010 and 2013, there was just about 7% of people who had loan balances that were in excess of $50,000. So again, kind of inconsistent with the story that we often hear or what you might imagine to be true based on the media coverage and the political discussion of this issue. And it's important to remember. So in this graph, I've broken out the average debt, again, in these same young households by educational attainment. So the different groups we have here are households that have a graduate degree, or at least one graduate degree, households with a bachelor's degree, and then households with some college. And unfortunately, due to data restrictions, our some college group includes people who have completed associate's degrees, but also people who have maybe started a degree and not completed, which we know those people are in really different situations. So what's very clear from this graph is that a lot of the increase that we've seen over the past 2 decades is coming from growth among people who are obtaining graduate degrees. So again, we think about there are maybe good reasons for debt to be increasing, bad reasons, or at least ones that are more or less concerning. I think most people would say that the fact that a lot of the debt is coming from folks who are investing in higher levels of education is maybe less concerning. These are high educated folks who tend to have high earnings employment opportunities. And when that's sort of conjecture based on this picture here, but the next figure I have actually illustrates that. So this is the idea that I'm saying, don't worry about those people who are getting graduate degrees and have lots of debt because they're going to make lots of money, right? And you may say, I don't know if that's true or not. Or maybe you believe me. You shouldn't, though. You should always question. So what I've done here is said, okay, well, let's look and see who is it that's really struggling financially, and how much debt do they have, right? Because that kind of checks what that last claim that I made. So what I've plotted here, this figure's really ugly, and I apologize for that. But what you want to think about is the vertical axis representing financial distress. So this, again, comes from that same survey. They asked the people in the households, have you made any late payments in the past month on any of your financial obligations, your cell phone, your mortgage, student loans, anything? So it's a really comprehensive measure of financial distress. And then they asked them again, are you 60 days delinquent on any of your financial obligations? So these just give you an indication of whether or not the household is struggling financially. Lots of other ways of measuring the same thing, but that's what I've used here. And so I've done that and plotted those incidents of financial distress against the level of outstanding debt in the household, which is along the horizontal axis. And the way that you read this graph is this bump here on the left-hand side illustrates the fact that the highest rates of financial distress or reported financial distress is coming from the households that have the lowest amounts of student debt. Okay? So, it makes sense when you think about it for a minute, but it might be one of those things that's a bit counter to the popular narrative, which would have you believe that the people with the largest debts are the ones who are struggling the most. In fact, this supports the notion that the people who have the largest debts are facing the highest levels of earnings and are being more successful financially in avoiding things like late payments or other types of financial distress. Something to think about here, when we think about solutions to the student loan crisis, a lot of times we think about very broad-based solutions that touch everybody who has debt. And one of the examples of that is student loan refinancing. So if you look at the proposal, some people would like to cut interest rates for people who have outstanding debt already. If we do that, what we'll be doing is providing a very large benefit financially to the people way up here and a pretty small benefit to the people right here, okay? And this is kind of exactly the opposite of what we'd want to do based on this evidence, which suggests that these people on the left who need the most help. So this isn't the first time that this trend has been reported, but it's important to reinforce that because this is one of those places where I think policy is stepping in the wrong direction because it's not recognizing the reality of the market. The reality of the market is that the people who need the help are not the people with high balances necessarily. There may be some out there. These are averages, right? But the people who need the help are concentrated among the low balance borrowers. Some of this may be driven by the fact that people are starting school and not finishing, We know that the financial returns to education do not accumulate linearly, right? So if a college education is worth 15% return, half of a college degree is not worth 7.5%. It's worth much less than that. So what happens is that you learn some skills along the way. The return is not so great really until you get that diploma. We call that the sheepskin effect. Okay, so unfortunately, spending money on a degree but not completing it really puts students in the weakest position financially, getting little to none of the financial benefits of higher education and facing at least some of the cost. Okay, so I want to come back to this figure here and think more about this notion of the long run return of higher education and how we're maybe a little mistaken in how we're thinking about it. So on this graph, I've plotted how income has evolved over time and how borrowing has evolved over time. So borrowing versus income. Okay, so this is kind of the calculation I'm telling you. This is what we do, right, to determine whether or not to do the financial cost benefit analysis. How income increasing over time, how borrowing has increased over time. So let me give you a fact here, and I'm going to ask you about it, so pay attention. Okay, so between the years on this graph here, which are 1992 and 2013, the increase in student loan debt was 3.2 times the increase in annual income. Okay, I'm going to say it again. Between 92 and 2013, the increase in student loan debt was 3.2 times the increase in annual income. So are things better or worse? It's a trick question, but just answer it, the naive way, and then I can go, aha, no, let me tell you the truth. They're better? Oh, you guys are too smart. You're supposed to say, no, they're worse, right? I guess I've already sold you on my case here. But one way to look at this is to say people are worse, right? So wage growth has not kept pace with borrowing growth, right? So borrowing has increased by a lot, and income for the people who have borrowed, which is different from the entire population, which is an important nuance, borrowing has increased by more dollars than annual income. Okay, people must be worse off, right? But this is a trick, because what I would like to have plotted here is lifetime income, right? Borrowing, dollar for dollar, does not need to, income at an annual basis does not need to keep pace with borrowing for people to be as well off or better off. Right? Lifetime income needs to keep up with borrowing for people to be better off than they were in earlier periods. So another way of thinking about this is that the increase in earnings received over the course of 3.2 years would pay for the increase in debt occurred when you compare people in the latest year to the earlier year. So yes, people in the later year are borrowing more, right? But they're also making more, so that extra debt that they've taken on, they can pay it back with their extra bit of income that they're earning each year in 3.5 years, right? And after that, all that extra income that they're earning, that's all theirs to keep. So that's a really rough way of thinking about how to do, without full data, a comparison of lifetime income to borrowing. We can't really do that exercise, right? We'd love to have a crystal ball that we could look into and say, this is how much you paid for your degree, and this is how much I know you're going to earn over the course of your lifetime, therefore I know you're okay. And that would be a great exercise, but we have not invented the crystal ball yet. So in practice, we have to do things like this and estimate what those relationships look like. This is probably not the best way of estimating it, but I think it does a nice job of portraying how we can make a mistake in how we think about how these things have evolved over time. Okay, so now I've convinced you that in the long run, borrowers today are better off than borrowers were 20 years ago, say, right? Let's suppose that I've sold you on that. You might also say, okay, Beth, that's great. You're really smart, and thanks for sharing your wisdom with us. I'm sure that's what you're thinking. But even if degrees are worth it in the long run, they may not, let me rephrase that, even if they're worth it in the long run, it doesn't mean people aren't really squeezed when it comes to paying those bills each month, right? In sort of a textbook world, we might think that people could take out a loan and pay back their debt over the course of their entire working career, right? If that were the case, then surely they'd be better off, right? But in practice, Department of Education gives you that federal loan, and the default is that you pay it back in 10 years, right? So I'm saying, look, over the long run, people are better off in terms of lifetime wealth, but in the short run, maybe they're squeezed. And so this picture is an attempt to understand whether or not that's the case. So what I've done here is try to come up with an indicator of the monthly burden of debt. And one way to do that is to look at the relationship between the monthly payment that's due on a student loan and the monthly income that a household has to make that payment out of. Okay? And so what I've done here is just plotted that ratio. So this is the ratio of payment to income. Another way of interpreting this is what percent of monthly income is being spent on student loan repayment. Okay, all the same thing. And so this is the one that I said, when I first plotted this, I thought, oh, it must be upside down. I must have put the ratio in upside down, right? It turns out that I didn't. And in fact, what we see is that over the past 20 years, the monthly burden has actually declined for households who are repaying their debt. Okay, so people are spending a smaller fraction, at the mean, people are spending a smaller fraction of their monthly income on loan repayment than they were 2 decades ago. So this is wildly inconsistent with the way that a lot of us would have imagined this relationship to work, right? Worth noting, of course, that the median is flat, right, but it's not increasing. Certainly not consistent with the idea that people are more squeezed now than they were 10 or 20 years ago. So it turns out there are a few reasons for that. Well, I should just say this number ends up at about 4. So if you lean on the median estimates, it puts us at about 4% of monthly income being spent on student loan repayment. When you fit that in with other household expenditures on a monthly basis, it lines up somewhere with like how much people spend on entertainment. Okay, so it's not a significant portion of their monthly expenditures. So a couple things are happening here. If you buy the last figure I showed you, you believe that in fact people who have borrowed are wealthier now than people who borrowed historically or borrowed 10 or 20 years ago. That would cause this to be true. But another thing has happened during this time, which is that loan repayment periods have lengthened. So the standard repayment period on a federal student loan is 10 years. But you're able to consolidate your federal loans into a longer repayment period if you'd like, or if you meet certain circumstances. And we also have introduction of different types of repayment plans during this, the period shown here. And what that has done is we can look at the average amount of time that it takes people to repay their debts, and during this period that has lengthened for those number of reasons. So if I just looked at this graph and I told you that in fact the monthly burden is less because people are paying back over a longer period of time, you'd say, that's not so good, right? I mean, that's not so convincing. But this, in concert with the other information that we have on the long-run benefits of higher education and the relative increase in wealth over time, those things together tell a much rosier story than I think a lot of us would have imagined before looking at these pictures. So one thing to think about is, again, we were looking at means and medians in that picture, telling the story of what's happening at the middle of the distribution. And you might say, look, I get it. The typical borrower is doing just fine. But what I want to know about is the person who's really in sort of extreme circumstances. Okay? So what we've done here is try to look at over time, what is the incidence of folks being in kind of a distressing situation when it comes to their student debt? And so we've done the same thing again, looking at the ratio of payment to income. And we've created these kind of arbitrary thresholds of 10, 15, and 20%. And we said those are pretty high levels of financial burden on a monthly basis for a household to have to meet, but sort of arbitrary levels, just to see how many people are falling into those categories over time and how has it changed over time. So what we see is that the frequency of households being in this position pretty consistently declines from the early 90s leading up until 2007, which is the beginning of the financial crisis. And following that point in time, it starts to tick up again. So the conclusion here, in the past several years, coming out of the recession, or going into and coming out of the recession, we see more and more households falling into these kind of more extreme levels of hardship when it comes to debt. And so the thing to think about here in terms of the policy perspective is that it's important to have safety nets, particularly safety nets that work in supporting borrowers through distress that may be driven cyclically, right? So we know that a lot of this is going to be driven through what's happening in the macroeconomy. Okay, so moving on, one of the things that people talk an awful lot about with debt is how it impacts different behaviors in the economy. And entrepreneurship is one, homeownership is one, and then just the economy in general. But the one that seems to really strike people is the potential relationship between debt and homeownership for young people. And part of the reason is that we've seen some evidence on this issue. And I think what's happened is that the evidence came out and the evidence was interpreted to be a little bit more strong than it really was. And so the initial study on this issue, trying to understand the relationship between debt and homeownership or purchasing of the first home, came out of the New York Fed. And what they did was they plotted over time homeownership rates of households that had student loan debt and households that didn't have student loan debt. And this is not the picture I'm showing here. This is my own work. But in their study, what they showed was that for the first time in recent year, the homeownership rates for households with student loan debt had fallen below homeownership rates for households without student loan debt. Okay, so for the first time in the history of their study, people with student loan debt were less likely than people without student loan debt to own a home. Okay, when they look at a young population. And so I think what happened is a lot of people saw that and they said, what we can conclude from that is that debt is depressing homeownership rates among young people. And unfortunately, that's just, it's not true. We don't have enough evidence to draw that conclusion. It's not necessarily wrong, but it's not necessarily right either. There are a number of reasons why looking at those trends may not tell you conclusively the causal relationship between these two phenomena. I was curious about this issue for a number of reasons, and so I attempted to replicate the work that they had done using a longer data series. And so that's what's illustrated here. So you can ignore the dotted line for now, but just notice that there's the blue and the green. These are homeownership rates among young households plotted over time. And the period of study in the Fed report that I'm referencing is actually somewhere over here. Okay, so they have a much more recent period of time. But what they showed in their study, as I said before, was that the homeownership rates of people with student loan debt had fallen below homeownership rates of households without student loan debt. And in their study, that was the first time that had ever happened. But what I've shown here is that when you look over a longer period of time, that's actually a reversion to the status quo. So historically, these households that don't have student loan debt were more likely than households without student loan debt to own their home. Okay, so again, this is not conclusive causal evidence either, but what it does do is call into question the conclusions that I think have been incorrectly drawn about this relationship. And it's just, a way for me to emphasize that a lot of the discussion about the impacts of debt are really on shaky evidence at this point in time. And so we want to be skeptical of those at this point. So I want to, I've been a little bit dismissive of this notion of a student loan crisis so far. My conclusion is not that there is no crisis in student lending. It's that there is no macro crisis, that the sky is not falling, the typical student is not in despair, and broad-based solutions are not the right answer. But instead, there are people who are suffering and struggling because of decisions that they've made regarding higher education, regarding student loan debt. And what I'd like to see is that this body of work pushes people to think about what those real problems are in student lending, rather than focusing on the macro crisis that I don't really believe exists. So my more recent work is trying to do just that. And so I want to give you some data from a study that I've done with another partner institution. We recognized in working with this institution on a study, an experimental study on their campus, that it may be the case that their students didn't actually know how much they were borrowing. So for an economist, this is sort of a surprising thing, because economists imagine that everybody operates just like those people in the textbooks. They make fully informed decisions, and they execute those decisions properly, and it turns out that's not quite the case. And so we did a survey on this campus to understand exactly how people's perceptions of their debt and of their costs compare to the reality. And that's what's illustrated here. So that in the top line, we have compared what we know a student is paying in terms of net tuition and fees after any scholarships to what they tell us that they're paying. And so the middle bunch there, 52%, is who actually gets it right or close enough to right. About a quarter of people underestimate at this institution how much they're paying, and 17% overestimate. The second line is about debt. So we see 38% of people actually know pretty closely to what they're actually borrowing. About 20% are underestimating how much they've borrowed, and a third are overestimating. So sort of surprising again to me that people don't know the answer to this question. Again, the survey population here is coming from this partner institution, but it's just looking at freshman students. So they're in their first year of study. They've signed one promissory note at this point. So this is not about an accumulation of debt over time that's causing them to be confused. The average net price for this population is $21,000, and the average debt at that point in study for students is $7,000. So, you know, these are small enough numbers that you can imagine that students should be getting it pretty right. But then the question became, is this a phenomenon that happened just on this campus, or is this a national problem, which actually caused us to look for an administrative data set at a national level that would allow us to answer the same question. So we were fortunate to recognize that the NIPSAS data set has both student reported levels of debt as well as administrative records on debt. So we know how much they've borrowed, and we have a report of how much they think they've borrowed, which is convenient for our study. And so it turns out that the students at the school that we were studying we're doing pretty well compared to the rest of the country. So this graph really just focuses on debt, so we don't have the data to compare costs, the real costs versus what the students think they're paying. Instead, we just focus on debt. And so when you ask this question, you don't care really if students know to the exact dollar how much they're borrowing, right? You care that they know kind of how much they're borrowing, right, within a certain margin of error. And so we did this test and measured how many people knew and didn't know but we allowed for different error tolerances to see if that mattered. And so the horizontal lines here are different error tolerances to still be considered correct on your estimate of debt. It turns out that that doesn't really matter. And that doesn't really matter because when people are wrong about their debt, they were really wrong about it. So moving that little margin of error that we allowed a little bit didn't really make a big difference. But what you can see in this is that about half of the people were significantly underestimating the amount of debt that they have. And again, this is first-time, full-time freshmen in the spring of their freshman year of study. So they've probably signed one promissory note at this point. They don't have a tremendous accumulation of debt. It's conceivable that they should know this, or reasonable to think that they should know this. So yeah, about half of people underestimating, about a third correctly estimating, and the rest are overestimating their debt. Probably the scarier thing that came out of this analysis is the fact that people don't always even know that they are borrowing when they're borrowing. So a lot of the people who are underestimating here were telling us that they have zero debt. So among the people that we know had federal student loans in this sample, 28% of those people that had federal student debt said, I have no debt at all. So almost a third of people that we know have federal student loans do not know that they're borrowing. And so, they said that they don't have any federal student loans. So then we questioned, well, maybe this is confusion over what type of loan they have, because we know that there's a private student loan market as well as the federal student loan market. So we asked the question again, or the survey asked the question again, and 14% of those same people said, I have no debt at all. So these are really high numbers. The difference between those two numbers tells us that there's pretty serious confusion about federal versus private loans, which is extremely important because federal loans have significant safety nets built into them. If you have low income after graduation, you don't pay anything on those debts until you're actually making some money. With private student loans, that's not the case, or generally not the case, and private student loans follow you through bankruptcy. So pretty serious differences between these types of loans. People don't know how much they've borrowed. They don't know what instruments they're using to borrow. And to me, this is a real crisis. This is what I'd call the information crisis in student debt and higher education. And these are the types of things that I'd like the dialogue about debt to be moving towards, thinking about things that are potentially solvable problems, but real concrete issues. So let me go ahead and conclude. Again, I want to emphasize I'm not saying that all is well here. I think I'm often misquoted as believing that. I'm saying that there is no singular crisis, right? The sky is not falling. We don't have a macro crisis similar to the mortgage crisis, which is something that's often asked. Instead, we have crises in higher education. And the reason I think it's really important to push back on this popular narrative is that continuing to talk about the macro crisis prevents us from talking about the real crises, which prevents us from getting help to the people who really need it in this market. When I think about what is the sort of pervasive big issue going forward that should be solved, it's about risk. And I'm happy to talk a little bit more about that, but I'll kind of leave it there for now. We need to correct the problem of risk in higher education. Higher education has a great return. If you think about it as an asset like a stock, it has a very high average return, but it's a risky investment. Policymakers should be thinking about higher education and debt in that light. And I think if we do that, we'll get to more of the right answers. Let me stop there, and I'll go ahead and open it up to questions if you have any.
Give me 1 second, because I do have a question.
Okay.
Can I start while you're...
Sure.
Yeah.
I'm trying to absorb the number who think they have no debt.
Mm-hmm.
Do they think they have no debt because they don't have a bill yet?
Potentially. So something that's kind of funny about the federal lending program is that students don't get a loan statement until they've almost graduated or after they've graduated. So at this point, these students are in their first year of study. They will not have received a financial statement that looks like a bank statement or a car loan statement. They will have signed a promissory note, so they have seen how much they've borrowed. They've gone through a training or like an online training, which probably amounts to them clicking through. But yeah, they may be lacking information.
They don't see a bill until they've 4 years or 5 years, or when they see a bill for whatever they've accumulated.
Right.
Yeah.
So basically, they get their first bill when they're ready to exit, whether exit is from dropping out or from completing a degree. Yeah.
So, looking at this from a broader social perspective,
Mm-hmm.
did you ever, or have you ever taken into account like the possibility of a rising cost of living into this data?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, part of the discussion about the rising costs associated with college is that people need to live
Right.
while they're going to school, right? So not only is the cost of attendance increasing through tuition and fees, but the cost of being able to get yourself into college and stay in college is increasing with the cost of living. You know, not everything is pegged to inflation, but the cost of attendance that determines eligibility for federal aid is in that it's the institutions that determine the living expenses for students. Yeah.
Anybody want to get a question in?
One in the back there?
Oh, I'm sorry.
That federal loan guarantees have factored into the increase over the past 2 decades, or you talked about at the early part of the presentation the rate of increase in tuition.
Mm-hmm.
Do you think that has factored into that rate of increase?
So the increased availability of debt, has it driven increase in tuition? Is that the question?
Has federal loan guarantees increased the amount of debt that students have taken on or have been able to take on?
What do you mean by guarantees in this case?
So if the federal government is guaranteeing student loans, then they're taking some of the risk away from what would be assessed otherwise by the private market.
Ah, okay. Got it. So actually, you're describing the system that existed prior to a pretty significant policy change during the Obama administration. So it used to be the case that federal loans were originated by private lenders. And the way that the government got private lenders to make these loans at prescribed interest rates is, one, they gave them a subsidy, and 2, they guaranteed a loan and said that if the student doesn't pay back and you've done all of the right things to get them to pay it back, then the government will pay. And so the lenders basically had a guarantee, and that made it more lucrative for them to make these loans. We went through a period where it was in fact very lucrative for them to make these loans, and they were aggressively pursuing institutions to build their businesses. I'm not sure that the lenders in that case had the capacity or the ability to get students to borrow more, because the students still worked through their financial aid offices to get debt. They were prevented from borrowing more by the aid eligibility rules and by the cost of attendance at the institution. So the financial aid officers were sort of the gatekeepers there. So I don't think so. I mean, what I thought you were going with that question is maybe the concern that the increased availability of dollars for college coming from the loan program are a potential driver of the increase in tuition that we've seen over time. And I think that's a possibility. We know that anytime we put a subsidy into a market on the consumer side, we're going to drive potentially an increase in price. So the supplier, in this case, which is the institution, can capture some of that subsidy depending on the elasticity of demand, right? Let's go back to 101 stuff here. And so that's likely the case with subsidies to higher education, in particular Pell Grants, which is really just a cash transfer to students. But then there's this question that the eligibility for debt is not really a subsidy, right? It's not free money for the consumers, but it's possible that the consumers are acting like it's free money, and it's causing them to be insensitive to the price that the institutions are asking of them. And that comes back to what I had said in the beginning about my concern over the trajectory of prices in this market, because I do wonder if it's the case that students are, choosing institutions blindly with regard to price. If it's the case that they don't know how much they're paying when we ask them in their freshman year, it seems pretty reasonable to think that when they shop for college, they're insensitive to that price in the first place. So sort of problematic.
It is a political season, and so we can't go without a political question. And since the university and the city are going to be the proud hosts of the last presidential debate, have any of the candidates, either current or even previous candidates, have they marked out any positions on this? Will this even be an issue?
It seems like it's an issue in the primary. So we've seen a pretty broad range of proposals here, from the Sanders campaign, which has proposed free public college, which is a pretty radical change from the system we have now, which is a market-based system with subsidies. The Clinton campaign has essentially increased subsidies to higher education and done it through the existing mechanisms for subsidizing degrees. The Bush campaign, actually had probably the most radical of proposals. They proposed really an entirely new way of financing higher education. It's through a vehicle that looks kind of like something that's called an income share agreement. So rather than students taking out debt from the federal government, they took out a financial obligation that they repaid according to how well off they are financially after they complete their education. So a pretty radical plan, which I think was probably not politically feasible, but I think will encourage some interesting discussions in Washington over the next few years.
I don't want to miss anybody. Last question. Okay. Sir?
Hi. So I'll try to rephrase this as best as I can.
Sure.
In regards to strictly looking at what you call the information crisis among college students, particularly freshmen, and not understanding their debt, do you think that, did any research look at whether it's a lack of financial education that is spearheaded through the K-12 system and not having either parents or administrators talk about finances to students? And what could administrators do to help students understand this in a better light?
Yeah, so I don't think we know exactly where there's a deficit in financial education, but there are a lot of studies going on at the moment trying to get people to obtain and process this information in a new way. Indiana University, they created a program where they started just mailing students their statements effectively, which is a pretty modest innovation, but they believe it worked to increase students' knowledge about their debt and actually change their behavior in borrowing. There are other ways of nudging information into the hands of students. Some other research on a related area has shown that text messaging works really well to get young people to retain and actually read information. So I don't think we exactly know. It's a behavioral question, and it's one that I think is best answered through experimentation and trying and measuring. As a researcher, I always try to encourage people when they try things, or people meaning institutions, financial aid offices, when they try things, measure and see if it's actually working. So I think that's how we'll figure it out.
Sir?
Yes, that is a great topic and a good research work you've been doing.
Thank you.
I worked in the financial aid at UNLV, and some of the stories you mentioned, I saw some students that they're not even done with their undergraduate, and they're like at 80,000 and 90,000. I have a friend at CSN, and she was refused financial aid this fall because she already reached the ceiling of the borrowing. So from your experience and research, what advice would you give to students to be rational in borrowing, or what should, because some students, I think, probably on the way of borrowing, they probably go higher than what they expect.
Yeah. I mean, I think when it comes to enrolling in education and paying for it anyway, whether it's through debt or through cash, I would encourage students to imagine their pathway more so than they probably are already doing. We've created this rhetoric around higher ed which says that everyone should just go to college, right? It's golden ticket. And I think that's caused a lot of people to go to college and find themselves there, but not really have an end plan, right? So maybe they don't know where they're going, and they're getting into this position of racking up lots of debt without an end game of have a plan for knowing how to pay it back. So I think it's better informed decision making on the front end. What do they do once they get into that situation? That's the tough one. We have safety nets in place in the federal loan program to, again, ensure that these people are not facing unaffordable monthly payments during the repayment period, and ultimately, if they don't succeed in generating enough income to pay it back, they'll be forgiven over a period of time. But yeah, I think it's the encouragement of better decision making on the front end, and maybe that's not a very satisfactory answer.
Would the U.S. ever be able to provide free education like Australia or Canada?
We absolutely could, right? I mean, people say that to me, is the Sanders plan feasible, right, to just make free public education? It's just a matter of the trade-offs that are implicit and whether or not those are consistent with the values of the country, right? In order to make college free, we'd have to raise more tax revenue. And then the result of that would be essentially a redistribution of wealth, right? Because there are a lot of people who are paying for college right now that can afford it and who are getting the returns, who under that new regime would be getting a huge benefit from it, right? And so do we want to raise taxes in order to create free college, knowing that a lot of the benefits are going to accrue to people who probably don't need it, with the hope that there are these other side effects of people, like you mentioned, just not getting themselves into trouble? And that's beyond the scope of my willingness to discuss here today.
Great. Thank you all. If you have an unasked question, we'll be around for a few minutes. Beth will be happy to talk to you. And thanks for coming.